So this is our final session for the afternoon on mandatory data breach notification, and I am going to chair it, which means that it's going to be kind of mandatory data breach notification for dummies, because I have no expertise at all in this area, but I'm really curious about it. So those of you who already have a huge amount of knowledge about this might find me quite dull, but those of you who are coming at it from somewhere around my level might find this useful. Let's find out. And I have three fantastic experts on the stage with me tonight. So let me, oh, what am I, doing a chat show? Oh, it's Graham Norton. It's just like that. We should have a red chair. So let me introduce our speakers. We have Susan Bennett, first of all. Susan is from Australia. She's the principal of Sabenco Legal and Advisory in Australia and co-founder and director of Information Governance ANZ. And her resume, which you have on a printed out form, it's so flash that I don't understand most of it. So all I know is that she is hugely experienced, and she's going to talk to us about the Australian experience where mandatory reporting has just come in. So that's going to be incredibly useful for us. And next to Susan, we have Davin Warner, who's Auckland Director of Simply Privacy, a consultancy providing privacy advice and strategy and training to business and government. He used to work for the Office of the Privacy Commissioner for 7 years, but then he left to go and sell those skills to the agencies that he used to regulate. So he's seen it from both sides. So this is good. And Sarah Alva'a. Did I do that? Good. Fantastic. I hate it when people get names wrong. So Sarah Alva'a is an experienced privacy and compliance leader, head of digital. It's a new position that you could have. Head of Digital Trust at Spark. And so she develops and implements privacy, governance, and compliance strategies and frameworks. So Sarah's going to talk about what that means for Spark and what their current practice is and what sort of changes they may need to make. So that's going to be really practical as well. And we're going to begin with each of our three speakers presenting to us. And then once that's done, we may all ask each other some questions, and then it's open to you to ask any questions that you would like to. So let's kick it off. Please give a hugely warm Wednesday afternoon welcome. Friday night welcome to Susan Bennett.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. So I thought I would quickly do a little bit of a partial global overview of where we sit with mandatory data breach notification. So we've had discussion about the GDPR today, but what you need to know about the GDPR in relation to mandatory data breach notification is that notification must be made where the breach is likely to result in a risk for the rights and freedoms of individuals. That is actually quite wide. The second important point is that notifications must be made within 72 hours of having become aware of the breach. That is an extremely short time frame. The third point, which you may not be aware of, is that the GDPR also applies to data processors and not only controllers. And so in relation to data breach notification, data processors also have a requirement to notify their customers and the controllers without undue delay after first becoming aware of the breach. So the position in the US, you may be interested to know that California was the first state to pass mandatory data breach notification laws in 2002. They were an early leader in this area. 50 states have now passed mandatory data breach legislation. South Dakota and Alabama were the last two states just in the last couple of months. Interestingly, few states impose a specific time framework for notification. Florida's within 30 days, Ohio and Wisconsin within 45 days. So you can start to see that we've got some differing notification periods emerging. Canada has their mandatory data breach notification comes into effect on the 1st of November of this year, and the standard there is where there's a real risk of significant harm to the individual. Asia. So in Asia, there are 6 countries that have mandatory data breach notifications: Australia, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, mainland China and Indonesia. One of the interesting things about this list is that mainland China and Indonesia don't have a minimum standard for harm, it's just notification. A quirk for South Korea is that if it's more than 10,000 records, in Taiwan you only notify the affected individuals. So as you can start to see, there are different countries they all have mandatory data breach notification requirements, but they differ in when you make a notification and who it's made to. In Asia, we've got Singapore and Hong Kong. Singapore has their new Cybersecurity Act, and that requires owners of designated critical information infrastructure, so that's things like energy and telecommunications, to report cybersecurity threats or incidents to the Singapore Cybersecurity Agency. They have a Personal Data Protection Act, and there's a consultation out and a proposal to introduce mandatory data breach notifications in Singapore. Again, the current consultation out for proposal has something a little bit different: any risk of impact or harm to the affected individual, and for data breaches of significant scale involving 500 or more individuals, even if the breach doesn't pose a risk of harm. Hong Kong, it's not mandatory, but it's expected by the Privacy Commissioner, and that's Privacy Commissioner Stephen Wong, and you're expected to make a notification to affected individuals and other regulators, including the Privacy Commissioner. There's quite extensive guidance notes in Hong Kong, both on how to deal with and give notice of a data breach for the Privacy Commissioner, and there are also guidance notes issued in the finance and banking sector on what to do in relation to data breaches in those sectors. So moving to Australia, as you probably all are aware, our notifiable data breach scheme came into effect in February this year. The legislation passed 12 months prior to that, and it requires organisations to notify individuals whose personal information is involved in a data breach that is likely to result in serious harm. So you notify the individuals and the Australian Information Commissioner. You assess the risk of serious harm holistically. One of the things I wanted to point out, which I think is very useful and helpful in the Australian context, is if an organisation takes remedial action so that the data breach would not likely result in serious harm, then the breach is not an eligible data breach and notification is unnecessary. So you may have a breach, for example, a contractor or an employee has sitting on information and there's an issue about that, it is a breach. But if you get that information back and it hasn't been, and you would do a forensic investigation and have appropriate stat decs or affidavits signed, but if there was no harm, then you would not have to make a notification. So what I recommend under the Australian scheme is that you've got to ensure that your data breach response plans are up to date. That includes things like your privacy impact assessments and technical security measures. We'll talk perhaps more about that in the panel discussion. And that there's an appropriate assessment process for suspected eligible data breaches. In Australia, you're to notify promptly, but you have 30 days in which to assess whether you have an eligible data breach. So, of interest, for the first quarter, so the new legislation came into effect on the 22nd or 23rd of February, and then until the first quarter, until the 31st of March, there were 63 data breaches notified, which is basically half of what was notified for all of last year. So, point number one is that the rate of notification to the Australian Information Commissioner has exponentially increased. Health sector comprised 24% of the notifications and ranked first in the top 5 sectors. The other sectors included things, of course, like banking and then professional services, etc. the causes of data breaches. This is a really good slide, but I don't know what's happened to the little numbers. But what it shows is that 51% of the breaches in the OAC report were due to human error, and 44% were due to malicious cyber attack or hackers, and no doubt we'll talk more about that, but very interesting that more than half of the data breaches are caused by human error in that first report that's come out. So the lessons learned from major data breaches, I think, can be summed up into 4 areas. Mostly they're preventable, whether they're human error, too simple passwords, patches not updated, or known problems with technical systems and technical weaknesses. The second big thing in a data breach are communication issues, both internal and external. The third point I wanted to make is the ongoing both legal and reputational fallout from a data breach. So you often have the initial response, but sometimes in these major data breaches they go on for years. The Target data breach happened in late 2014. I think in about April 2017 they settled with all the 19 state attorney general departments in the US. The costs, both direct and indirect, and ongoing, similarly for the legal and reputational issues. So I just briefly wanted to talk about three cases that I thought would be of interest. So we would all be aware of and recall the Equifax data breach last year, 143 to 147 million customer records, which is half the population of the US. There were also tens of thousands of customers affected in the UK and Canada. One of the issues in that case was they became aware of the data breaches and then didn't make a notification from somewhere between 6 to 9 weeks, I have read. So what did one enterprising senior executive do? Engaged in selling off some shares, as you do. And that person has been charged with insider trading. There were a number of lessons that you can take out from the Equifax data breach in relation to their PR and their communication. But at the time, the day that customers were made aware of the significance and the extent of the data breach, one of the internal marketing people tweeted out "Happy Friday," and there was some reference to "Thank God it's Friday" type tweet. They offered their own identification theft protection program for free, but the customers who took it up had to waive their legal rights not to pursue a claim against Equifax. There was huge outcry about this, and that was later retracted. The other point I wanted to make about Equifax is I read a report just in the last couple of weeks. Bear in mind it happened in September 2017. The cost to date are $242 million. They've filed in their first quarter returns this year. Most of that's been covered by insurance. I think it was about 40 million was due to IT remediation. And bear in mind, this whole problem arose because they didn't patch a known application weakness that was an exposed weakness for 2 months, which is how this happened. So they then had to spend about 40 million on remediation costs and some 30 million on forensic investigation and legal costs. TalkTalk was a UK telecommunications company. The incident happened in 2015. It was the largest fine issued by the UK ICO in 2016, £400,000. Again, it was a simple IT error. The Information Commissioner for the UK, Elizabeth Denham, said that TalkTalk's failure to implement the most basic cybersecurity measures allowed hackers to penetrate systems with ease. Again, the initial responses increased TalkTalk's problems. For example, they were aware on the lunchtime of day one that there was a problem, and they didn't go and announce it to their customers until the following afternoon, by which point the CEO was then doing a number of interviews, including on the BBC 6 p.m. news the following night, and included in it, she said that potentially all of their customers' information had been impacted. And there was a criminal investigation, and by that time there were media accounts that it could be Russian cyber attackers and various other nefarious organisations. It turned out, in fact, that there are about 147,000 customers' records, not 4 million, and the criminal investigation ended in the arrest of a 16-year-old Northern Ireland boy and I think possibly a couple of other teenagers. So there are talks talked about as one of the lessons in how not to communicate when and how important that is. And Talk calculated that the breach cost it more than £80 million. I don't know if you've heard about what happened in Australia last week. I think this is an incredibly interesting example in the post-Facebook Cambridge Analytica world that we now live in. Potential data breach of 20 million account details from 2000 to early 2016. So that would include me. It's very interesting because the bank hired a subcontractor to decommission a data storage centre, and in that they were to destroy backup magnetic tape drives of customers' financial statements. They were to do that in 2016. Shortly afterwards, is my reading of it, CBA realised it hadn't received the certification that the backup tapes had been destroyed. And it carried out its own it retained a Big Four accounting firm to carry out an investigation. The Big Four accounting firm concluded it was likely they had been destroyed. OAC was informed, and that's where everything ended. Last week, when this came to light, because as you may know, we've got a big banking royal commission going on in Australia, and the big banks are under scrutiny, and there was another big report from our banking regulator called APRA into the CBA last week. This issue emerged, and what was really interesting to see both the Prime Minister and the opposition spokesman talking. The Prime Minister said it was an extraordinary blunder by CBA's part. The opposition spokesman said this is a red, white, hot issue. I can't remember the colour that he used, but people needed to be, industry needed to be taking customers' personal data very seriously. What I find really interesting about this is it's not apparent to me that there was any data breach, given the facts of that circumstance, but nonetheless we have the Prime Minister and the opposition speaking outwardly about this being another major issue. As a result, the regulator has been asked questions about what they were doing. And I've noticed that they've issued a statement saying they've sent a letter to CBA asking for further information on the incident. But I think that's a very interesting move, because it would seem to me that CBA complied with the law, but now we have a situation where people are expecting more than that, and that's an interesting move, and it's a communication and media issue as well. So my tips for data breach notification: you must be prepared. You need to ensure that you've had internal training. You need to be proactive and able to respond very quickly. You need to have a data breach plan, and according to which in Australia it's quite prescriptive what your data breach response plan should include, so you need to make sure that it's up to date. You need to review and make sure that you understand the mandatory data breach notification requirements for the jurisdictions that your business is operating in. I would also recommend that you have prepared or have reviewed, if you've already prepared, template data breach notifications. You should, if you're operating in different jurisdictions, be able to have only a couple and one main template that should be able to satisfy the notification requirements of most regulators. You need to carry out privacy impact assessments and information security risks assessments. That's one of the recommendations from the Australian Information Commissioner. Train all of your staff who are responsible for handling of personal information to reduce the human error, and communicate effectively and accurately. So you don't over-communicate, you communicate accurately and what you know as soon as you know it.
Thank you, Susan. That's fantastic. Round of applause. So that's given us a picture of what's happening around the world and also specifically in Australia. And as you know, I'm sure I don't need to say this, but we've been doing voluntary reporting for up until now, and there's a bill before Parliament to make it mandatory. And at the moment we do about the OPC receives about 132 voluntary reports, notifications a year. So going on the Australian numbers, that's probably half of what's really, or even less of what's really going on. So lots of questions that we need to ask, but let's start with Davin talking to us about your experiences.
Thanks.
Yes, round of applause, make him feel welcome.
And I have to say, it doesn't surprise me at all that a Northern Irish teenager was behind the TalkTalk data breach. Unfortunately, we get up to quite a lot of mischief in Northern Ireland. That's why I left. I'm just going to very quickly run through the privacy bill proposals. What are we in for in New Zealand, and what does that mean for us? I'm sure 99% of you have read this already, but it might be a good way to kind of reframe the discussion and make sure we all know what it is we're talking about. I also wanted to note at the outset, just a quick thought about the rationale for mandatory breach notification. I see it as serving two key purposes. The first is ensuring accountability, and that's sort of both for the agency itself to demonstrate accountability, but also for the Privacy Commissioner or any other regulator to have confidence that agencies are being accountable to them for their privacy practices. So it kind of unearths stuff that would only otherwise be unearthed if there was an individual complaint. And then the second, perhaps more important point about mandatory breach notification is it gives individuals the ability to protect themselves from harm. And I think that second point is important in looking at why the bill has defined privacy breaches in the way that it has, or notifiable privacy breaches. So just moving on quickly. And I'd also comment on Michelle's point, about the fact that we have a voluntary data breach notification scheme here, and that it's been really successful over the past few years. And in fact, I noticed that our numbers, Susan, are higher than the experience of the OAIC in Australia, which I think is very interesting. I think that shows in a way that we've got agencies in New Zealand that have already quite strongly committed to breach notification and can see the reasons for it and the reasons why it's important. So just running through the provisions quickly. I don't want to get too caught up in the technicalities, but let's just remind ourselves what it says. So firstly, a privacy breach is defined as an unauthorized or accidental access, disclosure, alteration, loss, or destruction of information, or an action preventing an agency from accessing personal information. So that might be, an example of a ransomware attack where your data is held away from you and it'll only be released for you to use again if you pay a huge amount of money. It could be caused by a person inside or outside the agency, partly or fully the fault of the agency, and it could be an ongoing issue. So that might be where you've got a vulnerability in a website or an app and data is trickling out of it slowly or has for a long time been accessible potentially. And then what is a notifiable privacy breach? Well, it's what we just described plus harm. And that's pretty simple, really. So we're saying the only thing we care about here in this scheme is breaches that could cause harm. And it does say has caused or would be likely to cause harm to an individual. And then harm is defined. And throughout today, we've had other people commenting on the way the bill's drafted. It doesn't change the definition of harm. I haven't read the full bill in detail, so I'm really afraid of saying something about somewhere else in the bill, and someone will say, no, it does. Did you not read that bit? But I don't think it changes the definition of harm. And so harm is defined as physical loss. It could be monetary. It could be physical harm. Harm to an individual's rights or interests, benefits, or significant emotional harm. Now, this is a test, obviously, that we've had for many, many years. The Privacy Commissioner's Office has many years of experience in applying that test when deciding if there's been an interference with privacy. And one thing I'd note later that I'll comment on right now is even the Privacy Commissioner's Office finds this to be a difficult exercise. You know, assessing harm on an individual complaint basis is hard. So I think the tying in of a definition of a notifiable breach to this test on harm is going to make it very difficult for agencies to know when they should notify and when they shouldn't. So once you've got a notifiable privacy breach, the bill requires you to notify the Privacy Commissioner as soon as practicable after learning about it. So different to GDPR, for example, where you've got to notify the regulator within 72 hours. This is as soon as practicable. And to notify affected individuals as soon as practicable after learning of it. Now, there are some exceptions around notifying individuals. Firstly, if it's not reasonably practicable to notify, say, 1,500 or 100,000 customers individually, then you can give public notice. So you can chuck a big media release on your website saying, we stuffed up, and hope everyone sees it. You can also decline to notify whether public or individual if certain exceptions apply. And these exceptions should be familiar to you because they already exist in respect of access requests. So you can not notify if notifying would prejudice the security of New Zealand. It's not going to happen very often for most of you. Or prejudice the maintenance of the law. If notification would endanger the safety of any individual, then you can refuse to notify. Or if it would reveal a trade secret. So that might be where notification reveals, say it's an app that's had an issue, notification of the precise details might in fact reveal too much about that app that would reveal a trade secret. Something to think about. You can also refuse to notify if it would be contrary to the interests of an under 16-year-old, or if it would prejudice the health of the subject, physical or mental health. Again, those are withholding grounds too. So this is the idea that notifying someone about a breach could do more harm to them than the breach itself. So those are some other examples you can use. But those are going to occur rarely. Generally, there is going to be a requirement, if it's a notifiable privacy breach, to notify the affected individuals. So consequences of a failure to notify. This has been talked about a lot today. Failure to notify the subject could be an interference with privacy of that person. Of course, that adds to the other interferences that could have occurred, perhaps as a result of a breach of Principle 5 or Principle 11, by virtue of the facts of the data breach itself. A failure to notify the Commissioner could land you with a $10,000 fine, obviously subject to the issues with government agencies getting criminal offences and this kind of thing. But it's important also to note that there's no defence to this criminal offence of a failure to notify for unreasonably believing that it wasn't a notifiable data breach. Which is really a really weird way to put it. So it's kind of like a negative, there is no defense, rather than it may be a defense to reasonably believe that this isn't a notifiable data breach. I'm not sure what the consequences are of the way it's been framed, but it's worth thinking about. Unlike the Australian example, it's also not a defense if you've taken lots of steps to mitigate harm or contain the breach. You still need to notify it if it's a notifiable breach. Though, of course, there is a thought, maybe Sarah might talk about this more, about whether you take sufficient steps to contain it so that it moves from being a notifiable data breach to not being a notifiable data breach because the harm has been removed. So there's probably a way to work that through. There's also a bunch of other stuff that not notifying could do to you and your agency, which we all know about. Things like failure to front foot means if the media finds out before you've told everyone, you're going to look way worse. It could increase the likelihood of harm to your clients, customers, citizens, whatever. Reputational damage from not notifying is probably worse than the reputational damage from the breach, and we've seen that with Uber. Loss of trust, and therefore reluctance to provide information, and damage to staff loyalty, which is a thing we saw as fallout from the ACC data breach, less about notification though, more about the breach. So, after rushing through all that, possible issues to consider here. A couple of things that have already been mentioned. It's going to be absolutely critical that you create a clear process and an escalation path within your organizations to handle the processes required to meet these obligations. Most of you will already have processes in place because you might have wider risks or incident or crisis management frameworks. Some of you might already do data breach notification voluntarily, so you can fit this in and just make sure the notification part of your breach process is really robust. There's no point in getting all your notification right if you can't spot a breach. So I think one of the most critical things for agencies is going to be educating your staff to recognize a privacy breach, and even more importantly, empowering them to speak up about it, because you need to know. And if you don't know, then you can't notify. Establishing rules about who should make notification decisions is also very important, because you don't want managers or heads of across a business or a government agency to make kind of random rogue decisions, and John ends up getting 3 notifications from the same organization. That could be really awkward. But also, the decision to notify customers or individuals affected has to be taken very carefully. Then we come to that decision itself. Assessing harm and avoiding under or over notification is going to be really difficult. And I suspect that due to the consequences of failure to notify, there is going to be more likely an over notification, because people won't want to get it wrong, particularly if there is clearly no defense for unreasonably believing it wasn't notifiable. And deciding when to notify, I think the other critical point here is, once you've decided to notify, that decision on when you notify your customer or your affected individual is a really difficult one. And I've worked with a few clients on trying to get this right, because you need to do it quickly, because you want to get your notification out before the media releases it, because the media want to get there first. I think with the Herald, they've got an official policy that their 3 key topics for reporting are shark attacks, car crashes, and data breaches. So those 3 things are going to get the front page. So you need to get your notification out before the Herald does. Sorry, Herald, but I'm an Aucklander, so I'm going to pick them. What was I saying? Yeah, so the other side to that, though, is that you also want to make sure you've got enough information to tell the affected individual what happened, because it's a bad look to partially notify an affected individual, to say, hey, you may have been involved in a data breach. We don't know yet, but we'll tell you later. That is just going to create more fear and more negativity around your brand. So you want to kind of get that balance right. Get it out before the media, but make sure you've got enough knowledge. So there's going to be a big scramble within your organization to get all the data you need. How did this happen? Who knows? What do we do next? What's the scope? Which data was involved? Was it these customers? Which system was it? You've got to get all this stuff together before you get your notification out. So that's going to be difficult. Avoiding pushback from the executive and board, well, actually, this is better for that, because mandatory notification means that you can tell your board or your executive leadership team that you've got to do it, so you've got no choice. That's kind of easy. The pushback came during the voluntary scheme, where they would say, don't see the point, frankly. This is going to be worse if we put it out there. Let's just bury it. So this is going to make that a bit easier. Looking to colleagues in Australia, getting some really good guidance from them. And I think looking at the OAIC website's a great idea, because they've kind of dealt with this for quite some time, or a little while. And enabling data subjects to protect themselves is really important. And we've got some good opportunities there. There's an organization called ID Care, for example, that works in New Zealand and Australia. You join it as an organization, so you give it a bit of money, but it's a free service to your customers, to the people you deal with, and they will provide coaching and forensic assistance when there's been a data breach. So it's a really good look for you to have that on your notification letter. Call this number, it's 0800, and they'll protect you. And then my final thought is just make sure you submit on the drafting of the bill, because I don't think it's perfect, and it could do with some really good kind of practical and pragmatic submissions from people who would have to put this into practice every day. So quick run through, and hopefully we get a good discussion. Thank you.
So that's a good look at what the Act eventually might look like, certainly what the bill looks like as it is. But let's bring it even smaller down to a specific company and find out what Sarah is doing with Spark while you're facing these major changes. Give her a huge round of applause.
Thank you, everyone. Well, at Spark, we have had the chance to do some practice breach reporting. Yahoo was an email provider for several years, up until a couple of years ago. And with Yahoo's major breaches, we, of course, were impacted and got lots of experience in how to tell our customers and how to try to do it as well as possible and what customers care about. So, look, we believe that... excuse me, sorry. So first up, breach reporting, it is valuable, but it's very difficult. So we landed very quickly, despite the fact that we didn't have a legal obligation to tell customers about Yahoo. It was very clear to us that it was the right thing to do for customers, because customers needed to know, because they needed to know what to do to protect themselves. So if we'd kept that information to ourselves, our customers wouldn't have known what risks they faced and what actions to take to potentially protect themselves against further harm. Another thing about breach notification, which I think is sometimes overlooked, is that we're often trying to tell customers how to keep themselves safe online. And we put a lot of information on our website and other places. But Customers don't find that stuff very sexy. They don't follow our directions very often, and other agencies here probably find the same. But when you're notifying customers about a data breach, their mind is far more open to receive messaging about what steps they can take to keep themselves safe in respect of that particular breach, but also going forward. So it's a great opportunity to engage with them on online safety issues. It also, while it's not a great thing to have to report to customers, it does provide you with the chance to show customers that you can be trusted and that you do want to do the right thing, even if you haven't got it right that particular time. Overall, it promotes transparency and trust as we move into a greater data sharing economy. The other thing that I can say from personal experience is that being able to speak to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner and his staff, and previously Marie's staff, on these issues is incredibly insightful, because they lend a calm pair of ears, and they ask lines of questioning that we may not have thought about internally because we are so focused on the customers and ourselves. So I know that there are huge benefits that come from sharing this information with the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. That said, while there's a number of benefits, breach reporting is difficult. You're trying to make tough decisions and make good judgment calls on complex, rapidly changing facts. As has already been mentioned, you're trying to work out when you've got enough information to make a good judgment call. Sometimes you're dealing with third-party providers who have got different interests from yourself, and they may have different legal and contractual obligations and different risks and perspectives to manage. So trying to get on the same page and take an aligned approach can be difficult. So it's resource intensive. Takes a cross-functional team, and despite the fact that you can have all of the data breach plans in the world and great templates, so far from what I can see, every data breach tends to be very unique, and the permutations and the particular impact on customers, or how to find the information you need and who in the business you need to work with, it varies hugely. So yes, it's good to have data breach plans, but you really need to be prepared to have all hands on deck at the time a breach occurs, and to just keep on asking question after question after question to get to the bottom of it. So I think mandatory breach reporting is a good thing. It's going to help us keep pace with international standards. It's going to provide an environment for trusted exchange of data into the future. But we are going to have a major mindset, all of us, in terms of really believing in the value of reporting and why we need to do it. Focusing on the individual impacted rather than our own organisational brand. And also understanding that reporting is mandatory whether or not the organisation or agency is at fault. So that includes maybe a third party, your provider, your vendor has had a breach, but you still need to be the one that's going to report it to your customers. It might be your employees made a mistake. And sometimes it's even going to be customers that may have contributed to, or even in some cases caused the data breach. But as the agency, you still need to be the reporting to them and other customers. So it's a tough, sometimes getting people to accept that we've still got to report can be difficult in those situations. So with that in mind, I wanted to look a bit more deeply at when we need to report. And the definition of a breach that would be reportable in New Zealand is similar to the GDPR standard, but it does seem, from my reading, to be broader than Australia. And perhaps more importantly is the reporting thresholds. So Darwin has already talked through what the Privacy Bill threshold looks like, and that's if the breach has caused the harms listed up there, or there is a risk that it will do so. Now that's actually a much lower reporting standard than Australia. In Australia, there's only a reporting requirement if a reasonable person, and that's the reasonable person from the perspective of the organisation, would conclude that access or disclosure would be likely to result in serious harm. So you can see straight away that's a much higher standard. Now GDPR, it is a little bit lower, but again, the breach has to be likely to result in a risk to the individual's rights or freedoms. And they've got a second tier for notification to individuals. That's only necessary if it's likely to result in a high risk to individual rights and freedoms. And look, in one sense, it's sort of good to have a low threshold because it's almost every breach needs to be reported. But I believe that doesn't lead to the right outcome. If we return to the reasons for actually notifying individuals of breaches, I think the primary benefit is to ensure that individuals can take steps to protect themselves. But if we have a really low threshold, my concern is that customers will be overwhelmed with notices from organisations, just in the same way that even as privacy professionals we're feeling overwhelmed with privacy policy notifications this month before GDPR. The risk is that customers will start to ignore the breach notifications, and they won't know how to distinguish high-risk notifications where they need to take action to protect themselves from those that are really just to tick the box. We had a whoopsie, we're telling you so that we can't be prosecuted, we can't breach the Act. The other danger is that staff and organisations will start to see reporting as more of a box-ticking compliance exercise, and they'll potentially lose focus on the main goal of putting customer safety first. And if breach reporting becomes an end in itself, it becomes a small industry, and potentially as organisations are diverting resources towards the reporting side rather than identifying and fixing potential breaches and stopping or increasing our security standards. I'm also concerned that New Zealand's breach reporting statistics will look bad relative to other countries. While we all know the reasons for having a lower reporting threshold, I doubt our media will be so kind, and unlikely, if they compare our figures to Australia and to GDPR, we're likely to come off poorly, and it may concern New Zealanders. I also feel that the Privacy Commissioner's ability to offer value to organisations who are going through data breaches could be undermined to some extent because they may not have the resource available if they're overwhelmed with a high volume of breach notifications. So I also encourage everybody to look at the bill as it's drafted and consider how your organisation might be able to meet those criteria. In practical terms, at Spark, having an agreed plan, strategy and principles for managing data breaches before they occur is essential. And it's much easier to do that before everybody's under pressure trying to fix a particular breach. So we have a breach notification policy, which is on our website. And so if ever any individual's under doubt, I'm able to just refer them to that notification policy and say, well, we say it on our website, so we've got to do it. So there we go. But it's much easier if you've had that approved before you're in that position. Putting the individual customers first, ahead of all other aspects, is the best approach in my perspective. It helps focus everybody in the organisation on what to do, and it provides clarity on the direction and the objectives of what we're trying to do. It's also the right thing to do, and it prevents recurrence of harm. The key thing to emphasise for people staff trying to work out what to do next in a breach is to really encourage them to put themselves in the customer's shoes, and that's to think about how could the customer be harmed by this breach, not just within your own agency and how they access and use your own agency's services, but also outside of your agency and other aspects of their lives. And also thinking about how the individual may feel. And as well as what's in the breach notification standards, its requirements, it's really important to think what else might the customer want to know. And you will know your customers or the individuals that deal with your agency best. So as well as looking at the notification requirements, I'd really encourage you to think about what your end users would expect. And if you don't tell everybody what they want to know, they'll probably ring up your contact centre or come online or go to the media anyway. So it's really good to put yourself in your customer's shoes. Finally, I think it's really important to be empathetic to any of the staff involved in the breach, whether that's having caused it, been part of it, or fixing it. If you don't have everybody on board in the organisation, there's a danger that you won't get all the information that you need to do the right thing for customers. It also supports a culture where people feel that they can report breaches and they know that they'll be safely fixed rather than trying to hide them. And of course, you all know that the working relationships that are built between people when you're under pressure turn out to be great long-term relationships. And by working with the people who have been involved in a breach and supporting them through that difficult time, you'll find they make great privacy and security champions in the long term. So I feel like data breach, there's lots of organisational learnings from every breach. Do have a plan, but be prepared to do a lot of hard yards in every individual breach because each one is different and it will take everybody's best resources to solve it for the customers. Thank you.
That's great, Sarah. So let me see if I've got this kind of right. So we all agree that mandatory reporting is a good idea. It's the way the world works. It's also the right thing to do, yeah? What you're suggesting, Sarah, is that maybe our definition in the bill thus far of serious harm is a little low. You would like it to be not quite so, because, I mean, I think you make a really good point that we're going to end up with more notifications than maybe other countries, and that doesn't look great, and it's also going to make people nervous and all of those things. Devin, do you agree with that from what you know of the bill?
The one thing I would say is that there is actually an element of seriousness sort of read into this based on the definition of harm in the Act. So, for example, emotional harm has to be significant emotional harm. So, you know, I think the harm is probably, I think in practice, the two provisions will be applied similarly.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues I see is that some of that harm is subjective. So particularly with emotional harm, agencies are going to have to be put in the place of deciding whether someone with an eggshell skull might at some point be impacted by a data breach. So that's a very difficult, as I said before, that's a difficult task even for the Privacy Commissioner to take, and you know, they've got all this experience. So for an agency to have to put themselves in a client's shoes and decide quickly, you know, as soon as practicable before the media gets out, that's a very hard process.
Right.
A big call.
Yeah. Let me ask one more question that I'm dying to ask, and then it's open to you guys. So start throwing hands in the air and we will get microphones to you. But the question I wanted to ask, so we've just been talking about the process of notifying a breach, but I looked through the stats for New Zealand, and most of the breaches occur because of human error rather than being hacked by the boy in the basement in Ireland. Bless him. So part of this, should it also be preventing breaches, or is this discussion really only about how to notify the breaches?
My feeling is there's already requirements in the Act to try to prevent breaches and also to try to monitor for them. So this is the key change, is the notification.
Okay, all right.
In Australia, it's quite clear from the data breach response plans that you have to say what privacy impact assessments you've carried out, and in the notification to OAC, what systems you had in place, whether they're technical systems or impact assessment processes, that sort of thing. So it will be taken into account in relation to what sanction you may be facing. So if you've got good systems in place and it's just something that's happened, and then you've put in place steps or systems or measures so it won't happen again, you're going to be in a much better position than someone who has just not put it on their list of compliance priorities. So I think the regulations are forcing people to put into practice best practice privacy. And, you know, last year the theme was trust and transparency, and try and communicate the benefits of privacy as a competitive advantage with your customers. So, you know, there's a different way of looking at it, but it will be taken into account in the breach situation.
Great. All right.
I'd also just note, I think that's a good point, but I think the mandatory breach notification change has a downstream effect that affects the prevention issue, because by making it mandatory, many agencies that would never have had any reason to review their privacy practices or investigate something will now have to. So what it'll do is just lift practice because agencies are made to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
It's really similar to having a health and safety policy, right? You have the plan in place, and so that makes you aware of what's the practice that's going on, right? Okay, so questions from you.
Thank you very much. I was one of those Spark customers that got caught with Yahoo. And it was that particular time that woke me up to the danger that we were all in if we don't take care of our cyber security. What really annoyed me about that was Yahoo were very slow to first advise you, and then they didn't advise you with a truthful explanation, because Yahoo got absolutely slaughtered and they were not revealing all the damage that was done.
When I presented, I mentioned that agencies need to make sure that their staff can recognise a privacy breach and speak up, but this reminded me of the need also to make sure that your contracts with information service providers like cloud providers have a clause that requires those third parties to notify you of a data breach that affects your customer data, because you need to get that notification through any channel where you might not otherwise know.
And it's not just to notify you, but it's also to cooperate with you and give you practical assistance as well. It's really something to watch out for.
Is it initially going to make people really nervous that they're going to be going to their team leader or supervisor or whoever because they've sent an email to the wrong person? Is that what it's going to look like for the first little while?
That actually happens already.
Yeah.
And we encourage people just to come forward when that happens and just to help make a decision as to whether or not we should tell the customer concerned and so on.
Yeah.
But that's a key challenge, your internal communication systems, because often things are escalated, or they can be escalated as a flag, but the person to whom they're escalated doesn't understand that could be a data breach. So that's where the training and the internal systems and having the cooperative culture that you need in this area is so vitally important.
Hi, sorry. Just thinking about that issue of training and things, have you seen any sign of people almost shutting down, almost being afraid to communicate with third parties because they think, oh no, if I tell them this, it could be a breach, therefore it's better for me to actually not communicate with my customers and force them through other channel, through quote proper channels, even when it's information that you might think, well, no, there's no real harm here and it's actually getting in the way of customer service?
Well, I would answer this in a very general way. What's critically important here is the culture of your organisation. So if you've got a culture where people speak up and you've got good systems in place, you're less likely to have problems than in an organisation where things are not done that way, if I could put it that way. It's critical for boards and senior executives to understand how important this is, and that's why we say that you must have tabletop training, is what we call it, to understand how devastating a data breach can be, and also to understand the human issue in it. Sarah talked about working under pressure and having a cooperative team and being supportive. But I did a tabletop exercise last year with a group of privacy lawyers and privacy professionals where everyone assumed a role, like CEO, communications CFO, and what I couldn't believe was the dysfunctional behaviour. Some companies went under within 5 days because the CEO was held to ransom and didn't tell the CFO and the General Counsel what was going on. And this was not in what I normally do, a boardroom setting. It was actually with professionals. So that's why the training is so important. And it needs to be top down.
But I think also in terms of ensuring that staff aren't sort of too scared to move, I think the good thing about privacy is that it's something all of us understand as individuals, not just as part of an organisation. So it's quite easy for staff to identify whether or not they're sharing information about a person with that person, or if they're going to give them somebody else's data. So it doesn't tend to be a tough decision for people to realise, would this be a breach or not? Generally the breaches that happen by human error are where somebody's accidentally attached a document or sent the email to the wrong person by mistake. It's not should I or shouldn't I send this email? Generally they know who they should send the email to or the content to. So yeah, we haven't seen any shutdown so far.
Kia ora. I just want to touch on the resourcing side, just picking up on the funding, and I'm so pleased you're going to get more staff next week, John. But when it comes through to community service organisations such as ours, we tend to have all these regulations coming in and the compliance being handed down, and we simply don't get the resourcing with it, ever. So I think, I'm looking at this sort of particularly mandatory things, is going to be potentially quite a risk that smaller community organisations are going to have to carry, because they're not going to be able to put in place the sophisticated systems that are going to be able to react. And we do hold big databases of information, and by possibly miracle, I don't know of any of us having breaches, but it is always possible. So there's a I think that's something in the planning of this and how that's going to be rolled out that certainly would have to be something that's taken into account by government, because this has, particularly for mandatory things, there's lots of legislation coming through that now impacting health and safety, and all these things are rolling out, but it doesn't come with the resourcing to implement.
I'd just comment on that. I think there's a couple of things. So I think the current bill drafting includes a little bit of reasonableness in there. So it does talk about, if it's not reasonably practicable for you to notify every individual, if that perhaps is a cost or staffing issue that you can't meet, that you can do a public notice. So there are some concepts in the drafting that might try and address some of that resourcing issue, but I think it's worth making a submission if you think there needs to be more, or there need to be more exceptions to sort of account for particular circumstances. I think this is your opportunity to do that. But also I think these processes we talk about, I think we're coming from clients, or, for you, Sarah, your organisation, that we're talking about the big agencies that have thousands of staff and hundreds of thousands of customers. They need these really complex data breach management processes. But for smaller agencies with less staff, the processes don't have to be gold-plated. There just needs to be an awareness, and then there just needs to be somewhere they can go, whether it's just walking to your desk or calling a number. It can be that simple. And so I don't see that this complying with mandatory breach notification necessarily needs to be a huge resource burden.
On that,
Especially if there's no breach and you don't need to.
So there's lots of, so the GDPR is extremely onerous, and I've read reports just in the last month that some of the ways that it's now being dealt with are for companies to actually get rid of data. So they're not carrying the personal data that they were carrying. And, there's a perception that data is of value, and it's only if it achieves your organisational goals, or you've got a data set that's of value. There's a lot of data, most of it, that is kept within organisations that is of little or no value. So that's one of the other bigger issues, and obviously I look at this as a privacy and personal information in the bigger information quagmire paradigm, but that's another interesting aspect of what's happening with the GDPR, that some organisations, the compliance costs are such that they're just getting rid of the personal data that they hold. So it depends on what your business or your organisation is whether that's even feasible, but that's interesting.
Information quagmire paradigm is one of my favourite phrases from the day. We are out of time, I'm afraid, because we've got a couple of things that we need to do today. One thing here and there upstairs. But I think that was a really interesting session, and I feel like I know a lot more than I did an hour ago. Would you please thank Sarah and Devon and Susan? Thank you all so much. So I know that some of you need to leave. We're going to